Faithful God, you prospered the work of Joseph's hands in good times and in bad. Give us Joseph's unfailing love for you, that by the power of your Holy Spirit we might overcome whatever life throws at us. Amen. We are going to continue now in our journey through the Bible. We started a couple of weeks ago at near the beginning of Genesis with the flood story. Last week we heard the call of Abraham, and now we're going to skip ahead like 20-some chapters, and we're going to pick up in the story of Joseph at a very precarious point in Joseph's life. And Roger gets the distinct privilege of reading one of Genesis' most awkward stories. Thank you, Roger. But up to this point, just to give you a quick background on Joseph, Joseph was his father's favorite. He got a very nice coat out of the deal, and his brothers did not like that, so they threw him into a ditch, sold him into slavery, and now where Roger's going to pick up, he is a slave in Potiphar's house.
This morning's reading is from the 39th chapter of Genesis, beginning with verse 1. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had, from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good-looking. And after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she got hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant has treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. The word of the Lord.
Well, so I want to start with a story of something that happened to me really recently. As recently as last week, I had to go to Park City, Utah last week for a conference. And last Sunday, on my way to Park City, I was planning to spend a night alone in the wilderness of Wyoming, camping out. This is something that I used to do a lot when I was younger, but I haven't done recently very often. And as I told some of you about it last Sunday, you were a little bit worried, and some of you asked me, aren't you afraid of the bears? And the problem with that is that I secretly was afraid of the bears. And then when some of you asked me about the bears, then my secret little fear started to take hold of me, and I started to think quite a lot about the bears. And around 1 o'clock in that afternoon, as I was leaving my house and driving towards Wyoming, thinking about all of the possibilities of what could go wrong on my camping trip. What if the bears could smell my food? What if the bears came to visit me at night? What if all these things? And my mind was racing a mile a minute. And I was very distracted, and I did not realize that an SUV had pulled in behind me. You know the kind of SUV I'm talking about. It's white. It has black railings on the front, has a big floodlight on the side. I didn't know. And eventually, as my head is still spinning, I have no idea, this SUV is behind me. The blue and red lights start to flash, and I look at my speedometer, and lo and behold, I was going pretty fast. So as she gave me a ticket for a lot of money, and as I headed back out on my journey towards Wyoming, I thought to myself, that was a bad omen. What is God trying to tell me? Is God trying to stop me from taking this trip? Does God know that there are indeed bears at the campsite where I'm going to spend the night tonight? Well, I kept driving and my mind kept racing, and as I got close to the wilderness in Wyoming, I could see where I was going to be spending the night. My mind started to race again, and lo and behold, what happens? Not another cop, thank God. But I see my exit pass by me really quickly. And in Wyoming, that's kind of a problem because there's not a lot of exits in Wyoming. And so I had to drive like many miles out of my way just to turn around and come back. Another bad omen. What is God trying to tell me about this trip? And so now I'm just terrified about all of the things that could go wrong on my camping trip. And as I enter into the Medicine Bow Forest, there's a big sign greeting me right as you enter the forest. You want to know what it said? You are now entering bear country. I was going into their country. And here's the big sign telling me about all of my fears and anxieties. God is saying, turn back, Joe. Go find a hotel. Have a very nice night with peace and quiet and no bears. Well, I hike into my campsite and I set my tent up, and my mind is racing, my adrenaline's pumping. I'm so anxious. Every sound that I hear, every squirrel, every chipmunk, every bird, every fish jumping out of the water at this serene, beautiful lake has me on edge, squinting around the wilderness, looking for the bears that God had warned me about. Well, there were no bears. And it took me quite a few hours to finally calm myself down and try to find some peace and quiet amidst the normal sounds of nature. And long story short, what ended up happening is I had an incredibly beautiful, peaceful, restorative, and healing night in God's amazing creation. That night, as the sun went down and the night sky began to emerge, it was one of, if not the best night of stargazing I've ever had in my life. And as I sat there enjoying the peace and quiet of that moment, I was wondering to myself, why did I think all of those things that happened to me were such bad news? that they were such omens, such portends of the dangerous and scary things to come. Well, I think a lot of times in our lives, when something bad happens to us, one of the ways that we try to make meaning of something bad happening to us is to explain it away, right? It's too simple that a cop pulled me over and gave me a speeding ticket. It's too simple that I just missed that exit as I drove by too quickly. It's too simple that all of my fears and anxieties were right there on a sign saying, "You're entering bear country." It's too simple. It must mean something more. And so some people, when you face something bad in your life, some people make that out to be an omen or bad news or a warning. I remember when I was driving here from Dickinson, North Dakota, when I was moving here, I was in the car with my sister, and I think she's the one that sowed the seeds of this omen language in my life. Because as we were driving down, it was nighttime, and out of nowhere jumps this huge buck in the road, and I have to slam the brakes, and we're squealing to a stop not to hit this deer. We didn't hit it, but my sister says to me, "That's a bad omen." And then it turned out the next day, my dad calls and he says, "I have COVID." And I just spent a couple days with my dad. So we stop in the middle of Wyoming at this random, all of my stories are about Wyoming today, just thought of that. I stopped in Wyoming at this random clinic in this random town and got a test. And 30 minutes later, they call us on the road to say that I do, in fact, have COVID. First the buck, then the COVID. What's next? Should I even come to Windsor? I think once we start to associate bad events and bad news with each other, it's really hard for us to pull it apart. This bad thing led to this bad thing, led to this bad thing. So a lot of us do that. But a lot of us also make sense of the bad things that happen in our lives with something much more insidious and much more vicious to ourselves. And that's to think that we're being punished. Right? That God is somehow punishing me for the things that I have done. That cop must have pulled me over because I passed by somebody on the road and I didn't stop to help. And so now God is punishing me for my bad behaviors. Some of you might believe that. Maybe somebody told you that along the way and you just never forgot it. Or maybe that's the only way that you've learned to live with the mistakes that you've made in your life, that instead of forgiving yourself, you go through life expecting the worst things to happen to you because you somehow deserve it. As a pastor, I have heard a variation of this sort of thing so many times. That God is punishing me because I've done such wrong. Joseph, as you heard Roger read about in his life, had a lot of opportunities to think that his life was a punishment or a series of very bad omens leading up to some catastrophic event that was coming soon. See, Joseph made the mistake of being a favorite son. Out of 12 children, the Bible tells us that Jacob, his dad, loved Joseph the most. And being the favorite son, Jacob gave Joseph a very special and colorful coat. Must have been worth a fortune. And in case you need this little bit of parenting advice, this is not great parenting, right? It's one thing to wonder who's the favorite in our family. It's another thing for the parent to tell you who is exactly the favorite in the family. Joseph also made the mistake of being a gifted dreamer, right? Joseph had all these dreams that kind of made sense of the world and his life and could kind of tell the future. And in one of Joseph's dreams, he dreamed that he and his brothers were out in a field and they were gathering sheaves of wheat. And Joseph's sheaf was getting so big and tall that the other sheaves of his brother were bowing down to worship his sheaf. Now, if you need this bit of sibling advice, that's not a great sibling move, telling your brothers about that dream. And all of this is just too much for his brothers, and so they decide to kill him. That's how vicious and dangerous letting jealousy grow in your heart can become, that you completely turn on your own flesh and blood. So they take his coat, that dang coat, they throw him in a pit to die, and then they realize maybe that's not the best plan, so they take him out of the pit and they sell him into slavery. Joseph eventually finds himself in Egypt, sold as a slave to a man named Potiphar, a captain of the Egyptian guard. And meanwhile, Joseph's brothers bring his coat, and they get it all bloody, and they give it to his dad, convince his dad that he is gone. Now that's a bad omen. Now in Egypt, Joseph did pretty well. Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household, and Joseph basically becomes the trusted manager of a very important and powerful person. All things considered, this was probably the best case scenario for Joseph after being sold by his brothers into slavery. But I guess Joseph made one more mistake. The mistake of being too handsome. Because Potiphar's wife had some ideas, and I won't get into those ideas. And even though Joseph kept his integrity intact throughout all of these interactions with Potiphar's wife, still doesn't save him from the false accusations that he did not commit, of the crimes that he did not commit, as Potiphar's wife once again uses Joseph's clothing for proof and deception. And so Joseph loses everything again and is sent to prison, where he will stay for a very long time. God must have been really punishing Joseph. Except for what? See, Joseph's story doesn't really fit the mold of our punishing narrative, right? He's actually a pretty good guy. And the things that happen to him are not really his fault. Being chosen as the favorite, being gifted with dreams, being handsome, being falsely accused of a crime, these are things that Joseph cannot control, and frankly, he doesn't deserve what happened to him. Unlike some other folks in the Bible up to this point in the story who make all sorts of mistakes and have all sorts of questionable behaviors, Joseph hasn't. And yet his life has taken this very rough turn. Because bad things happen to everyone. That's the nature of life. We don't get to go through this life without a few bad things and without some suffering. Suffering is something that comes for us all, and we might be tempted when it comes to say that God is testing us, or that God is punishing us, or that God is warning us, to attribute to God some reason for making us go through this terrible moment in our lives. But Joseph's story tells us something different about God and our suffering, and that is that God is with us in the suffering. That bad things happen to everyone, even to pretty good people like Joseph, and when they happen, we are not alone. Here are some of these verses in the story that we just heard. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Verse 3, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he had and whatever he did to prosper. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Verse 23, the chief jailer paid no heed to anything that Joseph did, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. In the good times and in the bad times, the Lord is with Joseph. Throughout it all, God is still keeping that same promise that God made to Abraham in chapter 12, that God would be with Abraham and his descendants, and through Abraham and his descendants, God would bless others. This is a story that tells us that God is with us and that God never stops blessing others through us, no matter how bad it gets. This is what Jesus did. Right? Not just for Joseph, but for you too. See, Jesus entered into the suffering with us. Jesus got to learn firsthand what it was like to be hated, to be mistreated, to be arrested and tried for a crime he did not commit, to be humiliated and to die. Not as an omen, not as a punishment, but as a part of our real lives, real life and its sufferings, and Jesus entered it to be with you. And in Jesus, God wasn't just with us in our suffering. God learned what it was like to suffer with us so that God could bring us through it. To give us hope that no matter what happens in this life, Jesus is giving us a future. My friends, this life that we live is so hard. We don't have to make it harder by attaching God's punishment or bad omens or whatever it is to this already difficult life. Instead, listen to what the Bible is telling you. That rather than God being against you, God is with you. Rather than God standing far off in a cloud, sending you bad omens, God is in it with you, leading you to a better day and blessing others along the way. When I got pulled over just like a quarter mile from my house last Sunday, it's because I was speeding. When I missed that exit in the middle of Wyoming, it's because I'm often really distracted by the thoughts that are going on in my head. When I saw that sign saying, "You are entering bear country," that's because it's bear country, and I already knew that. These are not omens, these are not signs, these are just part of our normal everyday life, and God is with us in it. Rather than warning me about going backpacking, what really happened is I had one of the best nights that I've had in a long time, feeling connected to my Creator, feeling restored and renewed by a God who is always with me. This is ultimately what Paul meant when he said in Philippians, some of your favorite Bible verses, 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, right? He said that sitting in prison. He said that amidst a life of a lot of difficult things, a lot of pain, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of setback. But Paul understood that no matter what he went through in his life, that Christ was with him, that Christ would bless others through him, and Christ would lead him to a better day. I don't know what you're going through right now, but I know this. God is not punishing you. God's not warning you. No, God is with you. And you are a blessing, and God will bring you to a better day. Amen.